Topic here is the Cold War perspective. This is going to try to link the Cold War to the 9/11 attacks, or at least give you some understanding of why the Cold War matters in a class on 9/11. So the significance of the Cold War is that when bin Laden writes in his 98 fatwa that the United States has been occupying the lands of Islam, I guess they can make connections to these events that are here. If you have no idea about the Cold War or what that's about, Cold War is pretty much a race between the United States and the Soviet Union to try to influence, nations and territories to their side. If we were in class, we would have played this board game that simply just, when you land on China as the U.S., China falls to you. If you land there as the Soviet Union, China falls to your side. And so the area that gets the most amount of territories wins in this particular game. Problem with the Cold War, and in particular Afghanistan, which is right here, Afghanistan plays a key role. That's where Abdullah Azzam is located, who's bin Laden's mentor. So blowback is a term that's used where the actions you make today come back and they have some pretty nasty consequences for you later on in the future. And 9/11 pretty much fits that particular mold. If you did not know, the United States during the Cold War aligned themselves with the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen was led by a man by the name Abdullah Azzam. Abdullah Azzam eventually comes in contact with these individuals, Dr. Fatal and al-Zawahiri. He's the current leader of Al-Qaeda, as well as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and pretty much most of the Al-Qaeda's early leadership in the 80s or in the 90s. They meet in the 1980s when the United States was fighting against the Soviet Union indirectly in Afghanistan to try to stop the Soviet Union from taking over that particular area. So at some point, the U.S. was allied with some of these individuals. So why is that important? Well, here are the 9/11 hijackers. And one thing you need to take note is that the 9/11 hijackers were easily influenced by people like Mohammed Zamar. Mohammed Zamar fought in the Soviet-Afghan War alongside of Abdullah Azzam, bin Laden's mentor. And eventually in the 1990s, he comes into contact with some of the 9/11 hijackers, and he has some ability to convince them to do what they ultimately end up doing. So in class, if we do not look at these flowcharts, pretty much all I did was I'd taken Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Iran, and just kind of giving you some information. Again, the main point for the Cold War is that the United States has its influence in a lot of these particular areas. And that's probably the reason why bin Laden writes this particular language, that the United States has been dictating to the rulers, occupying the lands of Islam, and so on. All right, so let's take a look at some of the events here. First up is going to be Libya. Not sure if you know, here's Libya on the map, but the United States had some influence in Libya prior to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan in the 1970s. In Libya, the United States had a relationship with King Idris, and King Idris was replaced by this guy, Muammar Gaddafi. When Muammar Gaddafi led his Green Revolution, he wanted to align himself with the Soviet Union by purchasing weapons. This, of course, created a bad relationship between the United States and Libya. To further complicate the relationship between the United States and Libya, the Gulf of Sidra incident in 1981, pretty much what happened here was international waters are recognized by this yellow line, and Gaddafi, the new leader of Libya, was claiming it was here. So, of course, there's two planes flying in this particular area that are Libyan planes. I guess they're arguing that they control the airspace here, and the United States winds up shooting those planes down. In response, a couple of years later, in 1986, Libyan nationalists bombed the Lobel Disco. So this was a direct attack response to the Gulf of Sidra incident. So the United States shoots down two planes, and in response, Libyan nationalists bombed the Lobel Disco. In response to the Lobel Disco, Reagan, the president of the United States, decides that he is going to bomb Libya, the capital, Tripoli, and that's kind of what's going on here. If you click these links, it would, look at the Reagan speech where he's talking about the United States, bombing campaign of Libya. In response to that, of course, Libyan Nationalist Board, they put a bomb in a suitcase and they destroyed Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. So the United States and Libya have a pretty bad relationship. let's move on now to Iran. So in Iran, here you have some of the main players. So what you need to know here is that the British have influence in Iran. Mossadegh wants to nationalize oil. When he does that, this prompts the United States to get in because there is a fear that communists are going to try to take over Iran. Why? Because resources cannot be controlled by the government. They have to be controlled by the people. Anyway, here we have Mossadegh here. Mossadegh is going to be replaced by this individual, and that is going to create some problems because his rule of Iran is definitely something that is going to be questioned. He is going to be viewed as a puppet of the United States. Here's an image of the Shah of Iran with Carter, the President of the United States in the 1970s. So I guess some people would be upset. They possibly might blame the United States relationship with Iran for all of the problems that are going on in Iran. I don't know, but what we do know is that the United States relationship with Iran's leader definitely seems to be problematic for some of the Iranian people. One, Ayatollah Khomeini wants to lead a Shiite revolution in Iran, and he definitely was successful. And in 1979, he led a revolution which created a bad relationship between the United States and Ayatollah Khomeini. The Shah was allowed to leave and winds up in the United States. And the Iranian people are upset because they want to bring the Shah back, to hold him accountable for his crimes against the Iranian people. In response to what here? Okay, we have the U.S. embassy being overrun by Iranian students. Why? Because they are upset that the Shah was allowed to leave. And so, what better way to show anger towards the United States than to take over the U.S. embassy? Here's an image of U.S. hostages, what becomes known as the Iran hostage crisis. In this particular crisis, Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, we talked about him before, he says that he openly supports Khomeini's revolution. Now we're going to move on to Iraq and Iran, and the tension between those. To understand those two nations and their problems, you have to look at the leadership and the majority. With the Shia and Sunni split, that's problematic with those two areas. So here's what we know: in the 1970s, late 70s. Iran and Iraq are going to go to war. Notice how they are right next to each other. They have a common border. Um, the leader of Iraq's Saddam Hussein starts to fear that the revolution that took place in Iran is going to take place in Iraq. As a result of that, this leads to the Iran-Iraq War, where Iran and Iraq fight a war for about 8 or 9 years. And these are just some images. Keep in mind, in that climate, the U.S. is going to have to pick a side. They cannot side with Iran because Iran has the hostages. So the bad relationship between the United States and Iran is probably going to put the United States in a position where they support Saddam Hussein, which is precisely what is going on in this image. Here we see Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein shaking hands, showing the relationship between the two nations. So yes, at one point, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, was an ally to the United States. To further complicate some of these issues, there are hostages that are in Lebanon, and the U.S. is going to have to figure out a way to get some of those hostages released, and this becomes the Iran-Contra affair. And the Iran-Contra affair, the United States sends not only weapons to Iraq, but they also have to send weapons to Iran as a way to kind of get the hostages released. And that is eventually disclosed and becomes an issue during the Iran-Contra affair. Which then leads to a situation after the Iran-Iraq War, where the United States and Iraq have, somewhat of a stable relationship, better so than the relationship with Iran. The problem here is that in the 1990s, Saddam Hussein takes that military in Iraq and invades the country of Kuwait. When he does that, the region starts to panic. Is Saddam Hussein trying to take over the region? And the United Nations intervenes. Notice Saudi Arabia is here. This is where Mecca and Medina are located. That's going to play significance because that is where the Prophet Muhammad, and it has religious significance for Muslims. And eventually, the problem is going to be what is going to happen with Saddam Hussein. If he takes over Kuwait, is he going to take over Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria? And so there seems to be panic. Saudi Arabia decides in this particular situation, we will allow the US and the UN to go to Saudi Arabia. And that's what this arrow right here is trying to show you. This, of course, upsets and angers bin Laden, who thinks that if anybody is going to defend Muslim and Muslims, the holiest places of Islam, it has to be Muslims and not the United States. Bin Laden in the 1980s spent his time in Afghanistan. I've already established that he comes into contact with a lot of Al Qaeda's leaders. Now we're talking about Pakistan and India. This one further complicates the issue. So, yes, if you're wondering, he just transitioned, and this particular war, which is in the 1990s, um, that is just the end of the U.S. Relationship with Iraq, where it really starts to go south from that point. So, in the early 90s, we're just transitioning here now to something that occurred in the 1970s. 1970s going into the 80s, Bin Laden is in Afghanistan. And there is a connection here. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, led to numerous loss of life, especially as a result of the Hind helicopter, which was killing many civilians throughout Afghanistan. Bin Laden, who had traveled from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan to fight along his Muslim brothers and defend his religion. He meets somebody by the name of Abdullah Azzam, and they lead a fight against the Soviet Union. This, of course, makes the U.S. allies with the Mujahideen, Abdullah Azzam, and Osama bin Laden. Problem is that in this particular war against the Soviet Union, they're using this Hind helicopter to really destroy the Afghan people. The only thing the Afghan rebels need is a shoulder fire missile. And that is where AQ Khan comes in. I don't know if you figured this out, but here is Afghanistan and here is Pakistan. The United States cannot go to Iran. Basically, what needs to happen is we need to get weapons to the people in Afghanistan, and we really cannot go in this particular area because the Soviet Unions either have influence, which means, or we have an enemy like we do in Iran, which forces the United States to use Pakistan. If you are not aware, Pakistan and India really do not get along, and India has a nuclear bomb, and AQ Khan is working for the Pakistani government to try to acquire a nuclear bomb. This particular image is showing you a bunch of weapons or materials that were needed to develop a nuclear bomb. AQ Khan is trying to figure out a way to get all of these particular items so that he could create a nuclear bomb for Pakistan in the event that India decides to nuke his country. That's where Charlie Wilson comes in. I know this is getting confusing. There's a lot going on here. Charlie Wilson is an American politician, and he is thinking like this. The Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan. The U.S. does not want Afghanistan to fall to communism. There are people in Afghanistan who are fighting, Abdullah Azzam, Bin Laden, al-Zawahiri, and so on, a bunch of people. The U.S. does not have a friendly relationship with Iran, and they need to get this missile in the hands of the people of Afghanistan so they could hopefully beat the Soviet Union. The only way they can do that is if they can somehow figure out a way for Pakistan to come aboard on the U.S. side and kind of help them out. That is where AQ Khan comes in. This, of course, comes from the book Deception, which is about the nuclear program led by AQ Khan. And the argument in that particular book is that the United States and the rest of the nuclear power countries that have the non-proliferation treaties decided that they would allow Pakistan to get the nuclear bomb because the U.S. would be allowed to send weapons through Pakistan so they could go into Afghanistan and help Afghanistan defeat the Soviet Union. Wow, that is a lot right there. As I've said, all of this stuff is important, primarily the role of Afghanistan, because the 9/11 hijackers will eventually come into contact with many of the people who were considered heroes in the Soviet-Afghan war. And that is it. That was a lot.